Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we're diving into a genuinely fascinating, multi-layered conversation that brings together two completely opposing worldviews. We're talking about a deep, sit-down dialogue between liberal atheist Bill Maher and conservative Christian Charlie Kirk. And what we're mapping out here isn't just your standard, run-of-the-mill political debate. No, it's a real exploration of their surprising agreements, and trust me, there are a few, and their absolute, profound philosophical divides. All right, let's just jump right into it.
To navigate this sprawling debate, we're going to organize our analysis into 5 distinct areas. 1. Liberalism versus wokeism. 2. Public order and personal freedom. 3. The Trump paradox. 4. The foundation of morality. And finally 5. The campus echo chamber.
So starting off with Section 1, liberalism versus wokeism. This is actually a surprising point of absolute agreement between Maher and Kirk, the strict differentiation between traditional liberalism and modern wokeism.
Maher draws a crystal clear line here. He explicitly defines his own liberal philosophy as striving for a colorblind society and seeking, practical political solutions, like a two-state solution. And he aggressively juxtaposes this against a woke ideology that he argues is just completely obsessed with race, seeing it absolutely everywhere, and pushing extreme geopolitical stances, like the river to the sea rhetoric. He basically views these as two completely different stops on the political train.
Maher argues that liberal and woke are not just different things, but very often total opposites. And Charlie Kirk, well, he readily agrees with this distinction. In fact, Kirk actually praises Maher for having the moral courage to critique the far left with the exact same ferocity and intensity that he usually reserves for organized religion.
Moving right along to Section 2, Public Order and Personal Freedom. Shifting from cultural definitions to actual social policy, we start to see how personal freedoms intersect with public boundaries.
And this really comes to a head when they discuss drugs. When exploring drug policy, the two debate whether legalization actually harms kids. Kirk questions if legal weed is driving up youth usage rates, but Maher responds with this highly specific observation from his own life, noting that young people, specifically the Nepo babies at Hollywood parties, are entirely skipping pot these days in favor of heavier stuff like psychedelics, LSD, and ketamine. According to Maher, pot is practically a relic of his generation.
This shared frustration really intensifies when they turn to the physical reality of American cities. Despite their massive ideological differences, both men vehemently agree that public spaces absolutely must be maintained. They share intense frustrations over the homelessness crisis, criticizing left-wing policies in cities like San Francisco that allow things like drug injection sites and unregulated street camping. Their consensus is pretty straightforward. The streets belong to the citizens, there's a total lack of government willpower to enforce public boundaries, and the practical solution, in their eyes, is to build supervised barracks rather than enabling people to live and suffer right on the sidewalk. But as soon as they align on public order, they pivot right back to a fierce disagreement on personal virtue. Maher unapologetically defends his marijuana use as a basic adult freedom, stating, "The most interesting place I can ever travel is inside my own mind, and drugs do help you get there." He uses it as a creative tool and a way to evaluate decisions. Now, this presents a stark, massive contrast to Kirk's rigid, faith-based sobriety and his deep concerns about the spiritual and mental costs of drug use. Which brings us to Section 3, the Trump paradox. This tension between personal behavior and public consequence perfectly frames their debate over one of the most polarizing figures in modern history.
So, Maher talks about experiencing a distinct paradox after actually dining with the former president. He notes that in private dinners, Trump is gregarious, respectful, and genuinely listens to opposing opinions. Yet Maher heavily criticizes him for his public actions, arguing that his public rhetoric actively frightens American citizens and predicting that his aggressive policies are fundamentally dangerous to the fabric of the nation. It's a real split-screen view.
When they start debating deportation policies, a really sharp contrast emerges. Notice the divide here. Kirk defends the deportations of alleged gang members as perfectly legal, supported by voters, and authorized by the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. Maher pushes back on this hard. He argues that disappearing people without proper trials violates the Constitution, that using a law from 1798 is a massive stretch, and that sweeping up individuals without definitive proof in court is a straight-up violation of fundamental due process. Now, we aren't here to pick a winner, but this lays out exactly where the battle lines are drawn between the two.
But you might be wondering, why even have the dinner in the first place? Well, Maher defends his decision to meet with Trump against intense backlash from his own side. He views this as an absolutely essential act of cross-aisle dialogue, arguing that shutting out political opponents entirely is exactly why the nation remains so fractured right now. It poses a really profound question for all of us. Does engaging with our political opposites validate them, or is it literally the only way a divided nation can heal?
Let's dive into Section 4, the foundation of morality. Stripping away modern politics entirely, the two men descend into the absolute core of their disagreement, the fundamental origins of human morality and the very existence of God.
Let's look at Kirk's theological worldview, which he outlines using some very strict, precise definitions. For Kirk, judgment is getting exactly what you deserve. Mercy is getting less punishment than you deserve. And grace is Jesus actually serving the sentence for you. Kirk argues that all humanity is inherently flawed by original sin and absolutely requires this divine grace to be made whole.
Now, Maher counters this entire theological framework by citing the American playwright Eugene O'Neill. I find a life with illusions unpardonable. Maher explains that his atheist worldview requires facing the random, often completely unexplained tragedies of the universe, like childhood illness, for example, without relying on the illusion of a prime mover or some perfectly designed plan. He champions a life of blunt, unvarnished reality.
But Kirk immediately flips that O'Neill quote right back on him, arguing that actually, a life without illusions is unbearable. Kirk contends that when you look at the incredibly fine-tuned physics of the universe and the absolute miracle of human consciousness, it actually takes far more faith to believe it's all just a random, accidental byproduct of a hurricane in a junkyard than it does to believe in a deliberate divine creator.
This leads right into a direct juxtaposition of their moral compasses. In secular morality, Maher argues that humans just intrinsically know right from wrong, like we know not to murder or steal, without needing the threat of hell or a religious text to tell us. Contrast this with biblical morality, where Kirk insists that without an objective truth and the foundation of the Ten Commandments, society loses its cohesion entirely and ultimately collapses into moral relativity.
And this philosophical divide clashes fiercely when they discuss sexual orientation. Maher points out that homosexuality exists all throughout nature. He views it as a biological reality with absolutely no moral dimension attached to it whatsoever. Kirk, on the other hand, adhering strictly to Scripture like the Book of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, views it fundamentally as a sin explicitly prohibited by biblical doctrine, noting that while all humans fall short, Scripture defines what is holy and what is not.
Moving to our final part, Section 5, the campus echo chamber. Despite these immense foundational divides we just talked about, the conversation beautifully synthesizes as they find common ground once again regarding higher education.
Both men rapidly fire off their shared grievances against modern universities. They entirely agree that campuses have transformed from centers of diverse learning into totalitarian environments that enforce a singular ideology. They decry the hostility toward Western civilization, the brutal suppression of heterodox opinions, and what they see as prioritizing visual demographic optics over actual diversity of thought. In a pretty memorable phrase, Maher even calls these woke curricula the Wuhan lab of bad ideas.
To highlight the sheer absurdity of the current system, they point to a massive, staggering number, $50 billion. That is Harvard's endowment alone. Both men agree that top-tier institutions have essentially morphed into bloated hedge funds that just happen to have a college attached, hoarding wealth and taxpayer research dollars while, in their view, pumping out ideological conformity.
Yet, even in their agreement on education, a subtle, fascinating divide remains. They both desperately want to protect the Western inheritance. But who gets the credit for it? Kirk views Western civilization and its fruits, like the Enlightenment, as a distinctly Christian inheritance. Maher, however, champions these exact same values, free speech, science, democracy, as a triumph of secular humanism, achieved in spite of religion, not because of it.
And that brilliantly brings us to the core of this whole explainer. Maher and Kirk managed to have a deeply respectful, multi-hour conversation without conceding a single inch of their core beliefs. So I want to leave you with this final provocative question to ponder. What truly holds our society together? Is it a bedrock foundation of shared faith, or is it our absolute, uncompromising commitment to shared freedom? Think about it. Thanks for joining us for this explainer, and keep exploring.